Racist cop kicks black woman. FBI agent, but he's stunned when she fights back. Have you ever stood at a crossroads where one decision could change your entire life in an instant? You've probably heard plenty of stories about people who've risen to success, about those who push through with relentless effort and determination. But have you ever wondered if someone could walk away from everything career fame and everything they've worked so hard for just to stand by their own principles? This is the story of Emma Hayes, a woman who chose silence over speaking out a decision that completely reshaped her life. And this story might just make you rethink the choices you're making in your own life. Today, we'll take a deep dive into her journey, one that's both courageous and painful. But the most important question remains: can silence sometimes spark a bigger change than words ever could? Before we get into this story, tell us where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. We'd love to know just how far this story is reaching. Now let's get into a story that you'll never forget. Emma Hayes was 32 years old, and to the outside world, she had everything. A rising star at one of the largest international legal firms known for her relentless battle against corruption, Emma had built a reputation as someone who could get things done. She was ambitious, driven, and respected. But in the quiet moments when the office lights were dimmed and the buzz of meetings faded, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The walls of her office, though sleek and polished, felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. Every promotion, every step forward, it seemed to come with a heavier price, one she was no longer sure she was willing to pay. The environment at her firm was one of glistening achievement, but underneath it was a minefield of contradictions. The leaders spoke of integrity, but their actions often told a different story. She was the perfect employee, smart, reliable, efficient. Yet the more she climbed, the more she realized that her success had come at the expense of something far more precious: her freedom, her sense of right and wrong. She had always believed in the cause, fought for justice, but now with each passing day, it felt like the system was slowly swallowing her whole. What was the point of winning battles against corruption if she had to sacrifice her own values to do so? And so the question lingered in her mind, as it does in so many of ours. Can we truly achieve success without sacrificing who we are, without losing the very values that make us who we are? This was Emma's crossroads, and this is where her story truly begins. Emma's world, built on years of hard work and dedication, was about to shatter. She had always prided herself on the integrity of the work she did, believing that her role at the firm was more than just a job, it was a mission. But one day, as she sifted through a set of routine documents, something stopped her cold. It wasn't supposed to be part of her responsibility. She was just a lawyer, not involved in the day-to-day decisions of the company. But as she looked over the paperwork, something caught her eye, something that didn't feel right. Her heart raced as she scanned the pages, barely believing what she was reading. There in black and white were details about her firm's involvement with unregulated partners, shadowy deals that skirted the line of legal and ethical boundaries. She couldn't look away. She thought back to the speeches she had heard from the firm's top executives, their declarations of honesty and integrity. She had always believed them, but now, as the evidence spread out before her, she couldn't ignore the cold, hard truth. The very organization she had worked so hard for, the one she believed was making a difference in the world, was playing a dangerous game behind the scenes. The company she had trusted was involved in secretive deals with partners who were anything but transparent. Her hands shook as she traced the lines on the page, each word seeming to burn into her mind. Was this really happening? Was this the price of success? Emma had heard whispers before, rumors about shady dealings that were never quite clear, always hushed and dismissed as misunderstandings. But this was different. This wasn't just hearsay, it was proof. Real, undeniable proof. Emma's stomach churned as she realized she had been blind to the reality of the organization she had so proudly served. Her mind raced. This was more than just a mistake. It was systemic. The truth was staring her in the face, and it was ugly. The very thing she had been fighting against in her professional life, the corruption, the dishonesty, was happening right under her nose. She had been a part of it, and now she didn't know what to do. The weight of this discovery sank into her like a heavy stone. She had spent years fighting against what she thought was injustice, believing she was on the right side of history. But now, as the truth unfolded before her, she couldn't help but wonder, had she been wrong all along? Was she just another cog in a corrupt machine used to perpetuate a system she had spent her career trying to expose? This wasn't just about the firm, it was about everything. The world she thought she knew was not as perfect as it seemed. And Emma was left standing in the midst of it all, staring down at the very thing she had spent her life building, and now she wasn't sure if it was worth saving. She thought about the headlines she had seen over the years, the massive corporate scandals that had rocked the world. Enron, Volkswagen. Stories of companies that had once been seen as paragons of success only to be revealed as breeding grounds for corruption, deceit, and greed. They had all claimed to be above reproach, just like her firm. Enron, once the darling of the corporate world, fell apart after it was revealed that its executives had engaged in fraudulent accounting practices to hide massive debts. Volkswagen, the proud German automaker, had been caught manipulating emissions tests, deceiving consumers and regulators alike. The stories of these companies were a shocking reminder that no institution was immune to corruption. No matter how perfect the facade, the truth had a way of breaking through. Emma couldn't shake the comparison. She wasn't working at Enron and her firm wasn't Volkswagen, but the similarities were hard to ignore. She had spent years touting her company's commitment to integrity, just like those companies had. Yet here she was faced with the undeniable evidence that she was part of something far darker than she had ever imagined. She wanted to turn away to bury the documents and pretend they didn't exist. But she couldn't. The truth had already sunk in, and now she had to face it. She had always told herself that her work mattered, that she was helping to make the world a better place. But now she had to ask herself, was she part of the problem? The realization hit her like a wave. She had been so focused on her career, so determined to climb the ladder, that she had never stopped to question the system she was helping to uphold. But now she saw the cracks. She could see the corruption creeping into every corner of the organization, and she knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. The shift in Emma's mindset was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. But the more she thought about what she had uncovered, the more the reality of the situation sank in. She wasn't just a lawyer anymore. She was a witness to a system that was broken and that was now threatening to consume her. She had always believed in doing the right thing and fighting for justice. But now she couldn't help but wonder if she was part of a bigger machine that was too far gone to fix. Was she willing to risk everything to expose the truth? Or was she just another cog in the system, too afraid to step out of line? The questions swirled in her mind, each one leading her down a darker path than the last. And with each passing day, the weight of her discovery grew heavier. She had to decide, would she continue to play the game, pretending everything was fine, or would she find the courage to break free and expose the truth? As the realization settled in, Emma knew one thing for certain. Her life would never be the same again. She had seen the truth, and now there was no turning back. The question was no longer about whether she was part of the system. The question was what she was going to do about it. As the weeks passed, Emma found herself standing at a crossroads, facing a decision that could change everything. The documents she had uncovered, the truth about her firm's involvement in unethical practices, were no longer just pieces of paper. They had become a burden, a heavy weight on her shoulders that she could not ignore. Yet the idea of confronting her superiors, of exposing the truth and risking her career, was something she couldn't bring herself to do. What would that accomplish? What if it only fueled the fire and pushed her further away from her goal of justice? So Emma chose another path, the path of silence. It was not an easy decision. In fact, it was one that felt uncomfortable at first, as though she was betraying everything she had worked for. But there was power in silence, she realized. A quiet force that could speak volumes without ever uttering a word. It was a way to stand her ground without the chaos of confrontation. A way to resist without fueling the anger that would only divide the world further. Instead of taking the direct approach, Emma chose to remain still to observe. She stopped participating in the everyday office gossip. She withdrew from the corporate politics that had once fueled her ambition. Every day she walked into the office, sat at her desk, and carried out her work. But inside, she knew she wasn't the same person anymore. She was no longer an active player in the game. She was simply watching the pieces move, waiting for the right moment to make her move silently and without notice. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how powerful silence could be. It had been the weapon of many great leaders throughout history. Mahatma Gandhi had used silence as a tool for peace, refusing to participate in the violent oppression of British rule. His silence wasn't weakness, it was a form of resistance, a refusal to engage in the destructive cycle of violence and hate. By choosing to remain silent, Gandhi showed the world that true strength lies in holding one's ground without the need for confrontation. Similarly, Nelson Mandela had spent 27 years in prison, a silent witness to the oppression of his people. But his silence was not passive. It was a deliberate choice to stand firm in his beliefs, to resist the apartheid regime with dignity and strength. Mandela's silence had been a statement, a testament to his unwavering commitment to justice. He understood that the fight for freedom was not always about being loud. It was about standing firm in one's values, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Emma thought of these men and others like them, individuals who had used silence as a form of power. She realized that she could do the same. She could stand still, let the storm of corruption rage around her, and still remain true to herself. In the silence, there was strength, and in that silence, there was a chance for change. It wasn't about doing nothing, it was about doing everything with purpose. Emma knew that her silence was a statement in itself. By not participating in the game, by not playing along with the corrupted system, she was subtly sending a message to those around her. She wasn't just a passive observer. She was silently challenging the status quo, making it clear that she would not be a part of something she knew to be wrong. This strategy, although quiet, was not without its risks. In some ways, it was far more dangerous than any open protest or vocal outcry. After all, silence is often misunderstood. People assume that those who choose silence are weak or that they have nothing to say. But Emma's silence was anything but passive. It was a quiet resistance, a refusal to bend to the pressures of the system. In the silence, she had found her power. Her decision reminded her of figures like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning, individuals who had chosen silence not in the traditional sense, but in a way that forced the world to listen. Snowden had worked quietly within the system, collecting the evidence of mass surveillance before making the decision to release that information to the public. He hadn't shouted his truths from the rooftops. He had carefully planned his actions, and when the time came, he spoke, but only after years of quiet contemplation. Chelsea Manning's silence had come in the form of withholding her voice from the system, choosing instead to let her actions speak for themselves. She had released classified information, not with fanfare or applause, but with the quiet resolve of someone who believed that what she had seen needed to be known no matter the consequences. Both Snowden and Manning had chosen silence not because they were afraid to speak, but because they understood the power of their actions in the quiet moments of rebellion. Emma saw the parallels in their stories. She wasn't going to make a public outcry, nor was she going to confront her bosses directly. But she was going to let the truth seep out in her own way, in her own time. She would quietly work from the inside, refusing to contribute to the corruption, refusing to turn a blind eye. The silence would speak louder than any words she could muster. And so each day, Emma walked the line, quiet but unwavering. She didn't know how long this silence would last or what would come of it. But she knew that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to play the game. She didn't have to shout to be heard. She didn't have to make a scene to make a statement. Emma's silence was her rebellion, and in that rebellion, she had found a strength she never knew she had. Emma had always been the kind of person who valued her work. She'd worked hard to climb the corporate ladder, always striving to be the best version of herself in the office. She believed in her mission at first. But now, as the pressure from her colleagues and superiors grew, she began to feel the weight of it all. The more she chose to stay silent, to withhold her thoughts and actions, the more the corporate culture around her seemed to force her hand. The whispers around the office had started, and at first they were subtle. Her colleagues would smile knowingly when they passed her desk. They'd exchange casual comments like, "You're doing great, Emma," or "Keep doing what you are doing, you're getting noticed." But behind those polite words was the unspoken pressure. Emma was being pushed to continue the status quo, to keep playing her part in the system, to pretend that everything was fine, even though deep down she knew it wasn't. Her boss, the one who had always praised her work ethic, was the first to suggest that she go above and beyond. "You've been doing excellent work lately, Emma. Maybe it's time you take the next step. We could use someone like you to defend our decisions in front of the board." Emma froze. The implication was clear. She was being asked to protect decisions she knew were wrong, to continue down the path that was slowly eating away at her values. And there it was. the crossroads. The moment when Emma realized that she had to make a choice, one that would define who she was both professionally and personally. She had been given the ultimate to test her career or her integrity. On the surface, the choice seemed simple. After all, who wouldn't want to advance in their career? Emma had spent years getting to this point. She had invested time, energy, and emotion into climbing the ladder. But as she sat at her desk, staring at the same files she had been working on for weeks, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Her sense of ethics, the core beliefs that had guided her throughout her career, were now in direct conflict with the demands of her job. And in that moment, Emma had to ask herself, how much am I willing to sacrifice for the sake of success? It was a question many people face at some point in their lives, though not everyone is able to answer it honestly. How many times have we heard stories of people who have compromised their values for a paycheck, or to climb the corporate ladder only to find themselves empty and disillusioned? Later on, Emma had seen it before in the faces of her colleagues, in the way they seemed to justify their actions when confronted with uncomfortable truths. It's just part of the job, they would say. Everyone does it, but Emma didn't want to be like them. She didn't want to look back on her career and see a trail of ethical compromises behind her. The pressure continued to mount. Every day, her colleagues subtly encouraged her to keep going, to ignore the ethical dilemmas that kept her up at night. Just keep your head down, Emma, they would say. It's easier that way. But what was the cost of keeping her head down? What would be lost if she ignored her inner voice, the one that told her that what she was doing wasn't right? Emma knew the answer, though she didn't want to admit it. The price of silence wasn't just losing her voice, it was losing herself. Losing her sense of who she was, losing her dignity. At the same time, Emma couldn't ignore the harsh reality of the corporate world. She had seen it happen too many times, people who had spoken out against unethical practices only to be ostracized or fired. The system was designed to reward those who played along, who kept quiet, and turned a blind eye to the wrongdoings happening right in front of them. And Emma could see it clearly now. The people who made it were the ones who knew how to blend in, to play the game, to protect their own interests, even if it meant throwing their ethics out the window. So the question remained, could Emma continue her career without losing her soul? Could she strike a balance between professional success and personal integrity? Or would she be forced to choose between them? The pressure to conform was real, but the cost of conformity was high. It wasn't just about sacrificing her values, it was about becoming someone she didn't recognize. This is where many people get stuck. They face the choice between maintaining their integrity and advancing in their careers. And far too often, they choose to keep going, to stay quiet, to avoid rocking the boat. They justify it with thoughts like, everyone does it, or it's not that bad. But in doing so, they lose a piece of themselves. They may not see it immediately, but over time, they begin to feel the emptiness inside, the growing disconnect between who they are and who they've become in the pursuit of success. Emma knew that if she chose to stay silent, to continue protecting the system that she knew was flawed, she would be making a choice that would haunt her. It wasn't just about the career she had built, it was about the person she was becoming. Would she let her fear of losing it all drive her to compromise her values? Or would she find the courage to stand up, to make the difficult choice, and to fight for what she knew was right? It wasn't an easy decision, but Emma knew that she had to make it. The longer she stayed in the system, the more she felt herself becoming a part of it. The more she tried to ignore the wrongs happening around her, the more she realized that she was complicit in them. And that wasn't a future she could accept. Emma's journey was about to take another turn, one that would force her to confront her deepest fears and test her strength in ways she never expected. But the choice was hers, and it would define not only the rest of her career, but also the person she would become. Would she continue to play the game, or would she find the courage to break free and live according to her values? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain, Emma's path was about to get much more difficult, and the stakes had never been higher. It was the hardest decision Emma had ever made. Sitting at her desk, surrounded by the same files that once symbolized her professional achievements, she realized something she could no longer ignore. The life she had built, the career she had worked so hard for, was not one that aligned with her values anymore. It was no longer the dream she had once believed in. And the moment she acknowledged that truth, everything changed. Emma was standing at a crossroads, but it wasn't a metaphorical one. It was a real, tangible path that lay ahead. She could continue down the familiar road, staying silent, maintaining the status quo, and keeping her head down as her colleagues had suggested. It was tempting. The comfort of familiarity was hard to resist. After all this job, this company had been her identity for years. But she couldn't ignore the weight of her conscience anymore. She couldn't continue to turn a blind eye to the corrupt practices she had uncovered, even if that meant sacrificing everything she had worked for. In a world where success was often measured by titles, paychecks, and promotions, Emma realized that those things no longer held the same value for her. The respect of her peers, the praise from her bosses, they felt hollow. It was as if her soul was being sold piece by piece, and the more she tried to justify staying, the emptier she felt inside. She had worked for this moment, this job, this recognition, but now that it was in her grasp, she understood something profoundly different. Success without integrity wasn't success at all. It was a trap. So Emma made the bold decision to walk away. It was not just about leaving her job. It was about leaving a system that no longer served her, a system that was built on corruption, silence, and compromise. The decision was terrifying. It meant cutting ties with colleagues she had once considered friends, stepping away from the security of her career and embracing the unknown. But it also meant reclaiming her freedom, her integrity, and her self-respect. Leaving wasn't easy. There was a part of Emma that felt like a failure. Her peers would undoubtedly question her decision. After all, wasn't she walking away from everything she had worked so hard to build? The whispers would come, the judgment would sting, but Emma had made her choice, and it was one that came from a deep, unwavering sense of what was right. She knew that staying any longer would mean compromising her soul, and that wasn't a sacrifice she was willing to make. But this decision wasn't just about quitting her job, it was about something bigger. It was about understanding that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away from something that is no longer good for you. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought by standing firm and fighting. Sometimes they're won by stepping away and saying, "This is no longer mine to fight for." And that's where the real strength lay. Emma understood that now. She understood that true courage wasn't about proving others wrong or winning some external battle. It was about doing what was right for herself. It was about saying, "I will not let my values be compromised no matter what the cost." In the days that followed, Emma felt a strange sense of relief. The weight on her shoulders lightened, but it wasn't just the physical burden of her job that was lifted. It was the emotional weight, the burden of compromising her beliefs that had been dragging her down for so long. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. Free to be herself, free to pursue what truly mattered, and free to rebuild her life in a way that aligned with her values. Of course, the road ahead was uncertain. Emma had no idea what her future would look like. She didn't have another job lined up. She didn't know what her next step would be, but she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer willing to sacrifice her integrity for the sake of a paycheck, a title, or someone else's expectations. She had taken a leap of faith, trusting that by choosing the path of truth, the right opportunities would come in time. There's a saying that sometimes the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself. And for Emma, walking away from her career was exactly what she needed to do in order to rediscover who she truly was. She had spent so many years chasing success that she had lost sight of what really mattered to her: authenticity, truth, and living in alignment with her values. Looking back on it now, Emma could see how much of her life had been shaped by the pressure to conform, to fit into a mold that didn't truly suit her. But in leaving, she was taking control of her narrative. She wasn't waiting for someone else to tell her what she was worth. She was defining it for herself. And that was a powerful feeling. Sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that require us to let go of things we've worked so hard for. But as Emma learned, those decisions can also be the most liberating. The act of walking away from a system that no longer serves us isn't just about rejecting that system. It's about reclaiming our own power. It's about deciding that we are worthy of more than compromise, more than fear, and more than a life of silent acceptance. And as Emma walked away from the corporate world, she didn't look back. She didn't need to, because she had taken the most important step of all, the step toward reclaiming her true self. Emma had hoped that leaving the company would allow her to start fresh, to breathe freely, and to escape the shadows of a past she could no longer accept. But little did she know, Even though she had physically walked away from the corporate world, the echoes of her past would still chase her, lingering like an unwelcome ghost. It wasn't long after her resignation that the whispers began. People she once called colleagues, friends, even began to comment on her departure, and it wasn't with sympathy or support. Instead, they fed into the narrative that she had abandoned the very organization that had once celebrated her. The truth was never simple. Emma had always known that her work was not just a job, it was part of a much larger system. But now, as she distanced herself from it, the very fabric of that system seemed to tear her apart from the inside out. As the months went on, Emma found herself bombarded by a different kind of pressure, one that was far worse than the stifling office environment she had just escaped. It wasn't the pressure to succeed, to perform, or to meet expectations. This pressure was far more insidious. It was the pressure of public judgment, the stinging critiques of her decision to leave, and the accusations that followed. The system she had left behind had not forgotten her. Rather, it had turned its collective gaze onto her, and society seemed all too eager to agree. She was now the subject of whispers, rumors, and condemnations. In today's world where public opinion is shaped by every tweet, comment, and headline, Emma had unknowingly found herself caught in the snare of what is now commonly referred to as cancel culture. It's a phenomenon where individuals are publicly shunned, ostracized, and often stripped of their reputation for their past actions that sometimes didn't even come to light until they were deemed inconvenient or wrong by society's current standards. For Emma, it wasn't just her colleagues who had distanced themselves. The world at large had started to label her. There was a growing narrative that she had betrayed the very institution she had once served so loyally. No matter how hard she tried to escape that story, it followed her. The more she tried to live in peace, the louder the whispers became, accusing her of abandoning her post, of being complicit in the very things she had once fought against. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was doing the right thing by leaving, yet the world was treating her as if she were the villain. The term cancel culture wasn't something new, but it had certainly taken on a new meaning in Emma's life. She wasn't just being criticized for her past mistakes, she was being erased from the narrative entirely. Her name, once associated with success in the fight against corruption, was now being tarnished by people who didn't know her story. And what hurt even more was the fact that many of those who now spoke ill of her had no idea of the internal battles she had faced, the sleepless nights spent wrestling with her conscience. She wasn't the first person to fall victim to this modern-day phenomenon. The media was full of stories about celebrities, politicians, and influencers who were canceled because of past actions often revealed years after the fact. Take, for example, the case of Kevin Spacey, whose career came crashing down after allegations of misconduct surfaced. His name, once revered in Hollywood, was now synonymous with scandal. Similarly, figures like J.K. Rowling, once adored for creating the Harry Potter universe, found themselves under intense scrutiny and backlash for controversial statements they had made in the past. And then there was the case of Gina Carano, a former Star Wars actress, whose social media posts led to her being fired from her role. The pattern was clear: once you were labeled as wrong, there was no going back. Emma had found herself in the same position as those public figures, though hers was a far quieter, less sensational story, but the impact was the same. The world had moved on, creating a new narrative, one that excluded her, one that cast her as a pariah in a system that demanded conformity. What hurt most was the silence. There was no conversation about her side of the story, no space for the nuance and the difficult choices she had made. The social media posts, the news articles, the gossip, they all carried the same message: Emma was wrong. And worse, by walking away, she had betrayed the very values she once stood for. But here's the thing about cancel culture. It doesn't just erase people. It erases the complexity of their stories. It forgets that people are multifaceted, that they grow, that they evolve. It takes a snapshot of a moment, a single act or decision, and reduces a person to that one instance. It ignores the fact that people are capable of change, of learning from their mistakes, and of making difficult choices in the face of overwhelming pressure. Emma knew this truth well. She knew that she wasn't perfect. She had made mistakes just like everyone else. But she also knew that walking away from a corrupt system was not a betrayal. It was an act of courage. It was an attempt to break free from the chains of compromise, to stand up for something real. Yet the more society rallied around the idea of canceling her, the more Emma began to question herself. Was she wrong? Had she made a mistake by choosing to speak out? The doubts crept in, and for a moment she wondered if she had made the right decision after all. But then Emma realized something important. She realized that the very essence of cancel culture, the need to silence those who stand out to label them as wrong or flawed, was the very thing she had fought against in her career. She had spent years trying to expose corruption, trying to fight for truth, only to find herself caught in a system that now wanted to silence her. But Emma wasn't going to let that happen. She wasn't going to allow her story to be rewritten by those who didn't understand her journey. In a strange way, being canceled made her realize the power of her own voice. It made her realize that standing in the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it means facing criticism, is more important than any public approval or career advancement. Emma's story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And so as the months passed, Emma learned to embrace the scars from her past. She no longer saw them as weaknesses. Instead, they became part of her narrative, a story of resilience and growth. The world might have tried to cancel her, but Emma knew that the power to define her story would always rest in her hands. The more they tried to erase her, the more determined she became to tell her own story on her terms. And maybe, just maybe, that would be the most powerful thing she could do. Because no one, no matter how hard they try, can ever truly erase a person who refuses to be silenced. Emma sat quietly in her apartment, looking out at the city lights twinkling below. The world had already cast its judgment on her. She was the subject of countless whispers, media debates, and online conversations. But there was something inside her that urged her not to speak up. No press conferences, no social media posts, no interviews to defend herself or explain her decision. She had made up her mind long ago that her actions would speak louder than words ever could. In a world where everything seems to revolve around instant opinions and immediate validation, Emma chose a different path. She didn't need to use the media to justify her choices. She didn't need to explain herself to anyone. For her, the truth had a way of finding its own voice. And sometimes the best way to reveal the truth is by stepping back, letting the world figure it out on its own. Her decision to stay silent wasn't about cowardice or fear. It was a deliberate, powerful choice. She knew that silence could be just as loud, if not louder, than any speech or public statement. She understood that the truth has a way of cutting through the noise without needing to be shouted from the rooftops. It's often in the quietest moments in the stillness that the most profound truths are revealed. This wasn't a new concept to Emma. She had spent years working in the legal world, surrounded by people who believed in the power of words. Words spoken in boardrooms. Words used to sway opinions. Words designed to hide the truth. But in all her years of fighting for transparency, she had come to realize something crucial. Words alone didn't change anything. It was actions that spoke the loudest. She thought about figures like Greta Thunberg, whose silence at the UN climate change conference spoke volumes. Thunberg had chosen not to engage in the usual political rhetoric. Instead, she used her presence, her silence, and her actions to send a powerful message to the world. By simply being there without saying a word, Thunberg had challenged world leaders to take responsibility for their inaction on climate change. Her actions were her voice, and they resonated far louder than any speech ever could. Then there was Edward Snowden, the former NSA contractor who leaked classified documents revealing mass surveillance programs. Snowden's silence in the face of intense public scrutiny spoke louder than any apology or explanation. His decision to act to reveal the truth, despite knowing the personal and legal consequences, turned him into a symbol of resistance. His silence was an act of defiance, a refusal to accept a system that compromised his integrity. By withholding his voice from the world, he forced the world to confront the truth of what had been hidden. Emma wasn't trying to be a hero, but she recognized the power of withholding her voice. It was a strategy not born from fear, but from confidence in her actions. She understood that the truth, when left to unravel on its own, can be more powerful than any attempt to explain it away. The more she observed the chaos unfolding around her, the more she realized that sometimes silence is the most eloquent form of communication. As the months passed, Emma's quiet resistance began to take shape. She didn't fight back with words. She fought back with the choices she made every single day. She chose to live authentically, to be true to her own values even when the world tried to define her. In doing so, she allowed others to draw their own conclusions, to see the truth for what it was, without the need for her to speak it out loud. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always comfortable. The pressure to explain herself, to justify her actions, was constant. But Emma had learned something crucial. When you stand firm in your truth, the world has no choice but to notice. And while they might try to twist it, to turn it into something it's not, the truth will always find a way to stand tall. It will find a way to be seen even in silence. Her silence didn't mean she was passive. It didn't mean she was weak. In fact, it was the complete opposite. Her silence was a form of strength, an unspoken rebellion against a world that expected her to conform. It was a refusal to be part of a system that forced her to compromise her integrity. And while the world continued to debate her actions, Emma remained resolute, knowing that the truth had a way of coming to light in its own time. As the days passed, she watched as others around her, those who had once doubted her, began to notice the subtle shift. People who had once labeled her as a quitter or a traitor started to question their own beliefs. They began to see the cracks in the system, the same cracks Emma had seen long before. And slowly, quietly, her actions began to speak for her. The truth was unfolding one small, silent step at a time. Emma knew that in the end, the truth would prevail. It always did. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to justify her actions. All she needed to do was live them. The truth, when lived authentically, has a way of making its own impact. And in the silence and the stillness of her actions, Emma found the strength to continue walking her path no matter where it would lead. Because sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is the one you don't say at all. Emma leaned back in her chair, staring out the window as the city buzzed with its usual energy. The silence that had followed her decision to withdraw from the system now seemed to carry its own weight, its own power. At first, she had questioned whether this silence would ever amount to anything. Would her quiet refusal to engage in the fight really make a difference? But now, she was starting to see the cracks in the system, the subtle shifts that were slowly beginning to happen around her. It wasn't immediate. Change never was. But Emma began to notice that the people who had once been her closest allies, the ones who had worked alongside her within the organization, were starting to take a step back. Conversations that had once been centered around protecting the system, defending the status quo, were now turning in a different direction. People weren't just quietly accepting the way things had always been. They were beginning to question it. It was a slow evolution, almost imperceptible at first, but Emma could feel it. The way colleagues had once turned a blind eye to unethical decisions, now they were acknowledging the cracks in the foundation. They weren't actively speaking out, at least not yet, but they were no longer willing to protect the system. Emma's quiet resistance, her choice to walk away and let her actions speak for themselves, had planted a seed. And slowly that seed was beginning to sprout. This wasn't just happening within the confines of her old workplace. It was spilling out into the wider community. Conversations that had once been dominated by silence were now taking on a different tone. People were starting to see that the system, the one that had promised fairness and justice, was fundamentally flawed. And it wasn't just Emma who had noticed. Slowly, more and more people were starting to wake up to the same truth. This gradual shift reminded Emma of other social movements that had once seemed impossible, movements that had forced society to confront uncomfortable truths. She thought of the Black Lives Matter movement, which had gained momentum through the voices of countless individuals who refused to stay silent about police brutality. What had started as a whisper of discontent had grown into a global call for change, forcing people to question the systems of power that had been in place for centuries. It was the silence of so many people, the quiet strength of their resistance, that had ultimately caused the world to take notice. She also thought of the Me Too movement, which had broken the silence surrounding sexual harassment and assault. For years, these issues had been swept under the rug, ignored by those in power. But then one by one, women began to speak out. Their silence had been filled with action, with the quiet strength of refusing to accept the status quo. And slowly that silence became a force that could no longer be ignored. Emma could see the parallels. Like those movements, her own choice to remain silent, to step away from the system, and let her actions speak for themselves had started a ripple effect. The truth, when it was left to stand on its own, had a way of breaking through the walls of resistance. People were starting to question the system not because of any grand speeches or overt protests, but because they were beginning to see the truth for themselves. They could no longer ignore the cracks that had always been there. Emma knew that this was just the beginning. Change, she had learned, took time. It wasn't something that could be rushed or forced, but the movement was already gaining momentum, and it was growing in a way that couldn't be stopped. The power of silence, the strength in not fighting back with words, but with actions, was starting to reshape the narrative. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about a shift in the collective consciousness, a growing awareness that things could be different. Emma had done her part by stepping away, by choosing silence over speech. But now others were beginning to do the same. They were beginning to see that silence wasn't a weakness. It was a powerful tool for change, a quiet refusal to accept the injustices that had been allowed to fester for so long. And as the days passed, Emma could feel the energy of the movement building around her. It wasn't just a ripple anymore. It was a wave slowly but surely gathering strength. The system was starting to change, not from the top down, but from the bottom up. And Emma, in her quiet way, had played a part in that change. It wasn't about being a hero. It wasn't about getting recognition or praise. It was about standing firm in her beliefs, in her truth, and letting the world see it for what it was. The truth, when it's allowed to stand on its own, has a way of being heard. And Emma knew that the world was finally starting to listen. Emma sat in the quiet of her new home, a small house tucked away on the outskirts of a town she had never heard of before. The walls, bare except for a few personal photos, echoed with a peaceful silence she hadn't known in years. There was no hum of office chatter, no emails demanding immediate responses, no meetings to prepare for, and no one asking for her to defend decisions she didn't believe in. It was just her thoughts and the soft rustling of trees outside her window. She had made her choice, and though it had cost her more than she had imagined, Emma had found something far more valuable than any award or recognition. Peace. It hadn't been an easy decision to turn down the offers that came flooding in after she left her job. The organizations, the media, even former colleagues all seemed eager to honor her, to place her on a pedestal for the courage she had shown. The world wanted to celebrate her, to hold her up as a symbol of strength. Yet Emma knew deep down that the recognition would come with a price. The spotlight that once seemed so inviting would only pull her back into the world she had left behind. So she declined. She chose to remain in the quiet, to live her life on her terms, and to find the peace that had eluded her for so long. It was a strange feeling at first. The quiet felt almost foreign to her, a space she hadn't allowed herself to inhabit in years. She had been so caught up in the whirlwind of her career of fighting for justice within a system that seemed both corrupt and broken that she had forgotten what it was like to just be. Now, in her peaceful solitude, she began to understand what she had been missing all along. Peace wasn't something that could be earned through accolades or external validation. It wasn't something you could find by climbing higher in the corporate ladder or by winning the praise of others. For so long, Emma had believed that success was the key to happiness, that recognition from the world was the ultimate prize. But now she realized that peace came from within. It came from the quiet assurance that she had stayed true to herself even when the world tried to pull her in different directions. As she sat there reflecting on her decision, she wondered, had she made the right choice? Was it worth it to walk away from everything she had worked so hard for, from the position she had earned, from the respect of her colleagues, and the recognition from the industry? The temptation to return to the world she knew was real. But as she thought about it, Emma understood that the peace she had found in silence was more valuable than any success she could achieve in that world. It wasn't about being right or wrong anymore. It wasn't about being recognized for her actions. It was about living with integrity, about holding on to her personal beliefs, and about finding a way to move forward without compromising who she was. Emma had learned that true success wasn't about titles or awards. It was about making decisions that aligned with her values, even when those decisions weren't popular or easy. In this quiet life, Emma began to understand the importance of true freedom. Freedom wasn't about being able to speak your mind, as important as that might be. It wasn't about being able to act without restriction. True freedom, Emma realized, was the ability to live in alignment with your values, to make choices that reflected who you truly were, and to walk away from anything that didn't serve you, no matter the cost. The freedom she found wasn't the kind that came from a promotion or a high-status title. It wasn't the kind that came with an office with a view or an army of followers. It was the kind of freedom that came from knowing she had made the right choices for herself, even when those choices meant walking away from everything she had built. Emma's journey had not been about fame or recognition. It had never been about winning awards or receiving accolades. It had been about finding peace, about reclaiming her own voice in a world that often drowned it out. She had realized that peace wasn't something you could chase. It was something you created within yourself through the choices you made and the actions you took. And as she sat there looking out the window at the world moving quietly outside, Emma felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had made her peace. She had found the freedom she had been searching for, not through what she had gained, but through what she had chosen to leave behind. This was the real reward, the quiet confidence that came from living true to yourself. And in that moment, Emma understood that she hadn't lost anything at all. She had gained everything she had ever needed. As time passed, Emma's decision to step away from the chaos and stand silently in her truth began to ripple through the world in ways she never imagined. Her silence wasn't weakness, it became her strength. It wasn't about retreating into the shadows, but about choosing to live with dignity in a world that demanded compromise. Emma's story spread quietly like a whisper, carried through generations, inspiring others to stand firm in their own convictions, even when the world around them was pressing for them to conform. She became more than just a woman who left her career behind. She became a symbol for the young professionals, the idealists, the dreamers, who felt like they had no choice but to play the game or lose. Emma's journey was proof that you don't always have to fight back with noise to win. Sometimes the greatest victory is found in choosing to stay silent, to not engage in the destructive cycles, and to trust that truth, even in its quietest form, can alter the course of history. Her story was an invitation for others to find their own voice, not in the loud speeches or public confrontations, but in the stillness of their own beliefs. Emma taught them that sometimes change doesn't come from the big, bold actions, but from those small, subtle moments of resistance. The moments when you choose to live authentically, even if it means walking away from everything you know. It wasn't about fame, recognition, or wealth. It was about living in alignment with what you believe to be right, even if that means standing alone. As the years went on, Emma's influence grew not in the way many expected, but in a quieter, more profound way. She didn't just change the world by what she said. She changed it by what she chose not to say and what she chose not to do. Emma's story became a lesson for generations to come, that the greatest power is not always in the loudest voice, but in the actions that stand silently, steadfastly, and truthfully against the forces that try to silence us. And as for Emma, she finally understood that her silence was more than just a form of resistance. It was her voice louder and clearer than any protest or plea for attention. So if you ever find yourself standing at a crossroads where the world demands your compliance, ask yourself, can silence be your strength too? Can you, like Emma, stand for what's right even when no one else is watching? Thank you for being here. And if you believe that true strength lies in our ability to stand silently in our truth, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Because the real change starts with us. Quietly and together, we can make the silence speak louder than ever before.